Hi, everyone. Welcome to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And this week we are going to discuss judicial reasoning. Does Beit Din have to share? Should Beit Din share its reasoning with the litigants for whatever psak it makes? It seems like from Mishnah Zion in Perek Gimel of Sanhedrin, it seems like they don't really share their explanations. They just say, Ish ploni ata zakai, ish ploni ata chayav. So-and-so, you don't have to pay. So-and-so, you do have to pay. But it does turn out that there are times when Beit Din is supposed to share its judicial reasoning. Now, I want to think about this a little bit. I want to think about the question of what inspires trust in an institution. Now, today we would say transparency is what inspires trust in an institution. So explaining your reasoning could go a long way in terms of people trusting you, right? But I would also think today we have a little bit of an issue in our culture with lack of respect for expertise, right? Being able to distinguish between people who are actually expert in something, people who have trained in something, and people who are not. And so I could see the possible logic for not giving the explanation for the psak so as to leave a little bit of opacity and leave the expertise of Beit Din intact, right? We don't open ourselves up, Beit Din says, to everyone's understanding. There's a certain trust that you're supposed to have in Beit Din, and trust us. So I want to think about this with you today because it seems that there are two types of situations in which Beit Din is supposed to share their reasoning. One is where we think they might have made a mistake. And so what we're talking about here is accuracy, but it's still under very specific conditions. And another is where we think that the litigants are suspicious that there's some funny business going on, that they're actually not getting a fair trial. And so writing the reasons is incredibly helpful. So let's take a look. I will tell you that my friend, Professor Chaim Seaman from Villanova University, who serves on the Beit Din of America, I asked him about this, and he said the Beit Din of America does write out their reasoning, and Beit Din in Israel also write out their reasoning, and the latter is because it is required by Israeli law. Okay, so the default seems to be for the kinds of institutions that most of us use in terms of Beit Din, that they do share their reasoning. But let's take a look at where this all comes from to begin with. I'm going to share my screen. So the Gemara that's going to give us the reasoning of the reasoning, I'm going to say reasoning too many times and confuse you. The Gemara that's going to explain to us that a case where Beit Din should explain its reasoning is a case where we're worried about mistakes, is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. And it goes as follows: Amar Safra Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Safra says in the name of Yochanan the following case: Shnaim shenitzatmu bedin. Two people are disagreeing about where they're going to adjudicate their case. Echad Omer Nidon Kan. One of them says right here locally in our Beit Din. The Echad Omer Nilech L'Makom Avad. The other one says no, I want to go to the place of assembly. I want to go to the central court. I want to go to the higher court. Nonetheless, you force the litigant who doesn't want to go to stay, who doesn't want to go to the local anyway. You can't force the other litigant to pay to go to the Beit Vad. And if the local Beit Din doesn't know, they will ask the Beit Vad. They'll send them the case and ask it and get the information back. And if the litigant who didn't want to go to the local Beit Din says, I would like you to write out for me why you judged me this way. Presumably, this is the person who was told that they're chayav, that they have to pay. They write it out and give it to him. Now, it sounds like they write it out and give it to him so that he can take it to that Beit Havad, he can take it to that higher court to ask, to appeal, essentially, or not to appeal, but just to clarify and appeal if the higher court thinks that it's incorrect. And the Rambam says this directly. Our issue is we are worried about perhaps a mistake. Shnayim shenitzatmu bedin, achad omer nidon kan, achad omer na'ala lebeit din hagadol. Shema yit'u elu hadayanin. One of them says, let's do the local court. The other one says, no, let's go to the Supreme Court, right? Makes a real difference. That Beit Havad here is being Supreme Court, because I'm worried that the Dayanim here are going to make a mistake, and they're going to extract money wrongly. Kofinoto v'dan bi'ira. Person who wants to go to the Supreme Court, sorry, you have a local court for a reason. You have to go to a local. And if he says to them, I want you to write down and give to me me'eзе tam dantuni, why you are judging me like this, presumably he's being told that he has to pay something. Shema ta'item, in case you made a mistake. They write it, they give it to him. And only after that can they extract money from him. Because presumably now he can go to that Beit Din Hagadol and ask them, hey, is this correct? Okay? And by the way, if the local din has a question for the Supreme Court, they can write themselves to the Beit Din Hagadol, get an adjudication, and use that for their local. But here the issue is clearly ta'ut, and what brings about our concern for ta'ut seems to be the par, the gap in stature between the local Beit Din and a higher Beit Din, such as the Supreme Court. And nonetheless, it doesn't seem to say that we give the judicial reasoning even if the Baal Din doesn't ask for it, because presumably it's not going to go anywhere, meaning you give it to them, but they're not going to do anything with it. So why would you give it to them, right? And presumably the only reason they would ask for it is if they were forced to go to the local Beit Din. So you have all three of these dimensions together. There's a stature difference between the Beit Din where they're getting the adjudication and the Beit Din where one of them wanted to do the adjudication. There was a forcing of one of them to do the adjudication in the local Beit Din, and that person who was forced asks for the hanmaka, asks for the judicial reasoning in writing so that they can show it to the other Beit Din. Now, I think it's interesting. The Ramban actually says, I don't think, because we're talking about a Beit Din to Beit Din conversation, that if the Baal Din says, I want you to write out why you were mechayev me, and I'm going to bring it to another Beit Din, to the higher stature Beit Din to look at, because it's between the Dayanim, the Ramban says, don't write why you actually gave the psak din, just write the proceedings of what happened in the court so that Beit Din Hagadol can then adjudicate it themselves. The Ramban says as follows in number 6, even a situation of somebody who was forced to adjudicate locally, and kotvin lo lama chivu, they don't explain why they obligated this person. Ella kotvin, it's actually umishik ladun be'iro nami ein kotvin. I'm not sure where the nami goes, but either way, okay, we don't write why they don't write why they obligated him. Ella kotvin, they just write kach lekach ta'ano. Litigant A said this, kach lekach heshivo zed. This litigant said B said this, and we charged him such and such. And the scholars who are in the higher court, they'll know from that if this was a good judgment or not. Don't expose everybody to the inner logic and workings of the court, right? The Ramban is being very protective over the expertise of the court. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is, when we say that there's a difference in stature between the courts, what are we talking about here, right? We don't have a Supreme Court anymore, like a Supreme Jewish court. And so the Beit Yosef cites the Rambam, which I probably should have just given you the Rambam. The Beit Yosef cites the Rambam and says, well, yeah, I guess I'm giving you the Beit Yosef because he says a little more. So let's see. V'nira midivrei Rambam, da'afilu b'shenit atzmu, lo amrim shekotvin v'notnin, el k'shedan oto Beit Din katan, right? The only time we apply this whole thing is if we're talking about a local court that is essentially a lower status court. Because we think they made a mistake. But if one of the litigants didn't want to go to the Supreme Court and was forced to the Supreme Court and says, Supreme Court, I was forced to come here, I don't want to be here, You have to give me my reasoning? No way. Ain't good for low. We don't give it to them. Because we don't think they made a mistake. Because if we're going to start asking about the Supreme Court, then this thing never ends, right? So it's not just that someone was being forced, it's that they were being forced into a court of a lower stature. That's the point. And by the way, and this is the part where he's citing the Rambam, Vinit Ba'er, B'divrei Rambam, B'Perak HaNizkar, in that same parak, the Rambam says, Bizman hazeh, these days, makom sheish bo chachamim gidolim u'mumchim l'rabim, din beitin hagato yesh lahem. If there is a beitin that is, it's like the expert beitin, it's that everybody goes to, it's considered the highest authority. We would consider that like the Supreme Court. In other words, if somebody is forced to adjudicate in that court, they cannot ask for an explanation of the judicial reasoning. Right? So quite interesting. I will say, I gave you something in here from the Note to Yehuda, number 4, where he says, how do we know that somebody was forced into a Beit Din? Because one person shows up at the Beit Din and they have to subpoena the other person, right? That's sort of a process element. The Beit Yosef also quotes a Shita that we may not only be talking about, where the Baal Din asks for something at the end, but actually that one of the Baalei Din made a t'nai with the Beit Din that I'm only going to be here, I'm only going to adjudicate here if you are willing to give me in writing the judicial reasoning, and they even do a kinyan on it, right? So there may be some interesting, lots of interesting different ways this could go. But suffice it to say, we're worried about mistake. That's what we are worried about. There's another Gemara that discusses legal reasoning, where it doesn't seem we're worried about mistake. It seems we're actually worried about chashash or hashad. We're worried about mistrust. We're worried about people thinking that not getting a fair shake. So the Gemara goes as follows. Some of you may remember from Bava Metzia, Samach Tet Amud Aleph, and Samach Tet Amud Bet. Han hu trei kutai de avud iska bahadi adadi. There were 2 kutim, 2 Samaritans who were in a venture together, a business venture. And one of them split up the money that they had together without checking with the other one. They went before Papa, Amrle, and says, My nafkamina, who cares? Rav Nachman says, money, it's money, it's split, it's together, what's the difference? Money is money. What's the difference, right? If you have this half, you have that half, you have these coins, you have those coins, unless you're like a coin collector, right? You're looking for a 1910 penny or whatever it is, but money's money. Lishana, the next year, Zavon Chamri B'Hadi Adadi, these same 2 kutim, and by the way, it's very interesting that 2 kutim are going to Rav Papa, right? Brings up a lot of questions of the kutim and their affinity or affiliation with rabbinic Jews. They're coming to Rav Papa for adjudication. So the next year, the 2 of them, Zavon Chamri B'Hadi Adadi, they went in and bought wine together. Okay. Ham Idach, now the other person, not the person from last year, but the other guy, split the wine without asking, right? So these barrels are mine, these barrels are his. Coming to Rav Papa. Now they came before Rav Papa again because the other person didn't like them. Amrle, and Rav Papa says, man palaglach, who made this division? Who said you could divide this? You shouldn't do that without asking, without conferring with your business partner or with your shutaf, with your co-owner. Amrle, he says, what do you mean? You're just coming after me. This doesn't make any sense. Last year, he did the same thing and you had no problem. Is it just because I did it? Meaning, I don't trust you. I don't think you're giving me a fair chance here. I think you're matem mishpat. I think you're perverting justice. So Amar Papa says, in this kind of situation, you have to tell the litigant what your reasoning is. And so he did. He says, Zuze, when you're talking about money, Mishak al Tavi Bishavik Chasre, did he take the good coins and leave you with the bad coins? Which is probably a silly question, because if all these coins are actually work at market, they're all worth the same thing, right? So that's why the division doesn't matter. So Amar Le Lo. And so the guy says, no, of course not, right? Amarle, and then Rav Papa says to him, okay, but chamra, but when it comes to wine, kule amayadi, everybody knows the ika de basim, the ika de lo basim. There's some wine that's sweet and there's some wine that's not, right? You have to actually confer if you're dividing it up to figure out who wants what and who gets what. So he explains it to him. And here, you know, I this is not as formal as the Baal Din saying, uh, kitvuni, I want you to write, or, I want you to write something down for me, what your explanation is. It's simply that the Baal Din expressed concern that he just didn't believe that the judge was adjudicating honestly, right? And the Tosfot, Balei Tosfot explained this really beautifully. They say, Mashma dafka hacha lefi shayalo pitron pelachashto ka'amar detzarich lo aduye. The issue is because we knew that there's a reason, there's actually a pitron peh. It actually makes sense that the litigant might not trust the dayan. Because the truth is, when you compare last year's case, it does seem a little strange until he finds out what the logic is. It does seem a little strange that when his business partner did it last year, the Dayan said it was okay, right? So, yesh pitron peh, there is a leg to stand on for him to be suspicious, this Baal did, right? And so, in this case, he has to tell him, Mishum v'item nikiyah me'Hashem Yisrael. You have to be above board and be viewed as innocent, not just before God, but before Yisrael, right? People have to be able to trust that you're doing the right thing, right? But in general, you wouldn't have to do this, right? It's only if there's a pitchon peh, if only if there's something that explains why a person might be choshed you. Now, it's interesting because the Shulchan Aruch seems to say something a little bit more expansive than just whether is a pitchon peh. There's a reason why a Baal Din might not trust you. Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh Omrim, some say, She'im roeh hadayan she'Baal Din chushdo, that if the judge simply sees that one of the litigants suspects shenoteh hadin kinegdo, that the judge is specifically just trying to prosecute him and not trying to prosecute justice, but just trying to prosecute that Baal Din, tzarich lehodio me'ize tam dano, afilu im lo sha'al. Then the judge has to explain, this is why I am judging this way, even if the litigant didn't ask. So this is a little more expansive because it doesn't say when there's a pitchon peh that explains why the litigant doesn't trust the dayan. It's if the dayan sees that the litigant doesn't trust, then they should give the reason, right? So it's a little more expansive, and it's interesting to see that the Maharam of Rottenburg talked about a specific case and said that he did give the reasoning. Umin hadin lo hayinu tzarich lichtov me'ize tam psak. Right? There was this case where we didn't have to explain our reasoning. They wanted to come to us, these two people. But because of the reason that we didn't want a chashash, we didn't want them to suspect that there was any monkey business. We wrote for them what we think, meaning we know that transparency inspires trust. We want people not to think that we are perverters of justice, right? And the Or Zarua says it even strongly, not just I did it in a case, but you should always do it, right? It says Mikol Makom generally, Nachon hu l'chol yirei shamayim lichtov me'eze tam dan. If you're yirei shamayim, you're God-fearing person, you should write your reasoning, right? So that's like, we just moved from a Mishnah that made it sound like they walk in and say Ploni Zakai, Ploni Chayav, and that's it, to if you're your Shamayim, you better write your reasoning, right? And that is, it seems, common practice today. So it's kind of interesting because I guess when you're giving the explanation of because we're worried you made a mistake, you have to write your reasoning. I think that's where the more expansive you get and the more often you ask them to do the judicial reasoning and write it out, the less it's sort of the less you're investing in the authority of Beit Din, right? You're like constantly questioning the authority of Beit Din. So I can understand how, if it's because of a ta'ud, the only reason would be if there's a difference in stature between the two Beit Din, someone's forced to go to this Beit Din and is asking the lower stature Beit Din for it, right? So we kind of minimize when we're asking for the judicial reasoning because we need, you know, we don't like walk around thinking that they're all making mistakes, right? But if we're talking about a chashad, if we're talking about the reason of people will wonder, is this justice? Is this not justice? I could see being more expansive. I could see saying, you should always give it. Because if you always give it, you're basically saying, look, I want to be above board. And that's really important. It's really significant. We should be above board. So these two cut in different directions. I want to end with one other Gemara that Shakit Min quotes that kind of, it's like between the lines. It's kind of a different reason for giving the Hanmakah, for giving the reasoning. And that is just teaching, right? Just teaching people things that are important. It goes like this. Rabba bar Hanan b'Metzia Pegimel Amid Aleph. Tavru lehanu shakulei chavita dechamra. His porters broke his barrels that had wine in it. So Shakulei Glimayu, he took their clothes as payment because they owe him money now. Ato Amru LeRav. They went and told Rav. Amrle, Rav says to Rabbi Bar Hanan, you got to give them their clothes. And Rabbi Bar Hanan says, what? Amrle, dinanddaf, is that the law? Now, when he's saying, is that the law? Is he saying, I don't trust you? I think you're just against me? Is he saying, I think you're making a mistake? I think what he's saying is, come on, we know what the laws are here. They broke my barrels. My wine is all over the floor. Of course I'm entitled to payment. And what does Rabbi Bar Hanan say to him? He says, in yes, and not every version of this Gemara has the word yes, but here's the Hanmakah, here's the judicial reasoning. You ready? A pasuk from Mishlei, from Proverbs. Laman telech b'derech tovim, so that you walk in the way of good men. Come on, is he giving him like a real Hanmakah? No, he's saying, be a mensch. You have my money. These people don't have money. Don't take their clothes. What's the matter with you? Even if, maybe min hadin, you could, but you shouldn't, right? So he gives them the clothes. And then they say to their boss, hey, we're poor, but we've been working all day, we're hungry. But late on midi, we don't have anything. So you also have to pay us our day's wages. Now, you might say maybe there's like a little chutzpah here, but they're hungry, right? They're day laborers. They don't have anything. Amrle, Rav says to him, Zil Habagrau, give them their wages. Amrle, Dinachi, and Rav Bar Hanan says, this is the law. Again, you think he's saying, I think you're making a mistake, or I don't trust you, you're just against me. I think he's saying, we both know that I don't have to give them their wages. And Amrle, Rav says back to him, in yes, and not in all manuscripts does it say yes. Sometimes it just goes to the Hanmakah. The explanation for Archot Tzadikim Tishmor, the end of that pasuk, keep the paths of the righteous, right? Also from Mishlei, not exactly your like halachic text, right? Saying, be good. That's my reasoning. Be good. And he might even be saying, especially if in yes is not in the manuscript version, in some of the manuscript version, he might even be saying, yeah, of course you don't have to pay them. Of course you can take their clothes, but don't. And I, as a judge, am trying to teach you something, what we would call supererogatory, something that is above and beyond. Now, this is a good question in general, whether dayanim are supposed to be involved in supererogatory behavior for another time, and seems to be a machloket generally between Sephardi and Ashkenazi rishonim. But suffice it to say, we have our three reasons why Beit Din would give reasons. One, in a case where chayshinan l'taut, we're worried about a mistake. Two, where there is either a pitchon peh or simply an existence of a chashash, or a chashad, I should really say, of a suspicion that the dayan on the part of the Balei Din, or one of the Balei Din, that the dayan is not being fair or doing the right thing. And now I'm adding a third that's maybe a little less court oriented, but more teacher oriented. Explain to them why you're telling them, especially if they're surprised by your din. Explain to them why you're saying it, because you may teach them how to be better people. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.